New Epstein documents have now reached Congress, and within moments of lawmakers reviewing them, one reality became impossible to ignore. Someone with real influence appears to have been shielded, and for the first time, Representative Melanie Stansbury was prepared to say what others had only hinted at. As the documents were opened, the atmosphere inside the room shifted instantly. Staff members paused mid-sentence. Lawmakers leaned forward in their chairs, and Pam Bondi, who for months has worked carefully to manage public perception around the Epstein files, could not fully conceal her reaction when Stansbury began reading directly from the material. The moment was formal, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Stansbury was recognized to speak, and she didn't waste time easing into her remarks. She opened by thanking the committee and acknowledging the gravity of the hearing. This wasn't routine oversight. This was about a case that continues to expose deep failures inside the criminal justice system, failures that allowed powerful individuals to evade accountability for decades. She reminded the committee that important steps had already been taken, including the advancement of a discharge petition demanding the release of Epstein-related records. But she made it clear that the Judiciary Committee could not look at this issue in isolation. As a member of the Oversight Committee, she brought additional materials into the record, explaining that many of the most troubling issues in the Epstein case fall squarely within the judiciary's jurisdiction. Court failures, Department of Justice decisions, law enforcement breakdowns, all of it, she said, contributed to a system that repeatedly failed survivors. Stansbury then drew a firm line. This was not about party politics. Sexual abuse is not partisan. Justice for survivors is not partisan. And demanding truth, transparency, and accountability is not partisan either. These principles, she argued, are essential if the public is ever going to trust institutions that appear to protect powerful figures while ignoring victims. She outlined the Oversight Committee's core focus. First, identifying which influential individuals may have engaged in criminal conduct. Second, understanding why the justice system repeatedly failed women and girls who were groomed, assaulted, trafficked, and abused. And third, determining whether individuals with wealth, power, or political connections were deliberately shielded from investigation and prosecution. These questions, she emphasized, are central to the Judiciary Committee's responsibility. Then came the revelation that changed the tone of the room. Stansbury disclosed that, following a subpoena, the Oversight Committee had received tens of thousands of documents from the Epstein estate. Among them were more than 1,600 references to the current president. These materials include emails, financial records, correspondence, litigation files, and statements attributed directly to Epstein. She was careful to clarify that these documents contain allegations, including sworn statements, and must be evaluated through a serious, transparent investigative process. But that point only strengthened her argument. This is exactly why full unredacted disclosure is necessary. Partial releases, selective transparency, and heavily redacted pages cannot answer questions of this magnitude, according to Stansbury. The only way forward is complete transparency. The public inquiry matters because trust has been eroded. Survivors deserve answers, and institutions must prove they are capable of confronting power rather than protecting it. As she finished that portion of her remarks, it was clear the discussion had crossed a threshold. These documents weren't just records. They were evidence of how long the truth had been delayed and how much pressure it would now take to keep it hidden. Among the materials Representative Stansbury referenced were documents that immediately raised the stakes of the investigation. These were not rumors or third-hand claims. They were formal records tied to sworn testimony, legal proceedings, and internal correspondence. One set of documents described a sexual assault case in which Donald Trump was reportedly subpoenaed, formally served, and deposed. Another included sworn statements connected to a then 16-year-old girl who alleged she was recruited at Mar-a-Lago and later groomed and assaulted by Jeffrey Epstein, and others described as individuals with global influence. Stansbury then turned to internal communications. attributed to Epstein himself. In those emails and messages, Epstein allegedly claimed that Trump knew minors were being recruited from Mar-a-Lago. He stated that Trump had been present at Epstein's residence multiple times, that Epstein possessed photographs of Trump with young girls, and that Trump was what Epstein referred to as the dog that didn't bark, a phrase Epstein used to imply silence or lack of cooperation with law enforcement. The documents also referenced financial interactions between Epstein and Trump, discussions involving Trump's business dealings, and concerns raised internally about possible money laundering through real estate transactions. Stansbury was careful to note that these matters may or may not rise to criminal conduct, but she stressed that they clearly warrant serious investigation rather than dismissal. She then highlighted another critical contradiction. Materials from the Epstein estate indicate that Epstein himself believed he was facing a mandatory federal sentence of at least 10 years in prison. Yet despite that assessment and despite recommendations from his own line prosecutors, the Department of Justice declined to pursue federal charges. That record directly conflicts with sworn testimony the Oversight Committee received just months earlier from former U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta, who claimed credible evidence to pursue federal prosecution did not exist, taken together. Stansbury argued these documents form a substantial evidentiary record, one that the American people not only deserve to see, but are demanding to see. Justice, she said, matters because those who abused, enabled, financed, or protected this criminal operation must be confronted with the truth and face accountability. Transparency matters because without it, healing is impossible and trust in the rule of law continues to erode. She reminded the committee that Congress has a responsibility to ensure the justice system protects victims, not perpetrators, and that this responsibility extends to strengthening victims' rights legislation that will soon move through the very same committee. Her closing appeal was deliberate and restrained. Remove the partisanship. Examine the facts honestly, join the investigation, and help ensure that accountability is no longer optional for the powerful. When she finished, the room didn't react with shock or outrage. It reacted with recognition, because what Stansbury had laid out was not speculation or online mythology. It was documentation. It was sworn testimony. It was evidence, and evidence that raised a single chilling question: what exactly has been buried for decades? And who benefited from that silence? From her very first words, Stansbury cut through distraction without theatrics or political performance. She didn't attack parties. She didn't posture. She presented facts and let their weight speak for itself. She said it calmly but with unmistakable force. This case, she explained, was never about politics. It was about a system that failed survivors, shielded influence, and repeatedly chose to look the other way while powerful people operated without consequences. The moment those words landed, the committee room went quiet, not because people disagreed, but because they understood exactly what she was saying. Someone with reach had been protected, someone with connections had walked away untouched, and the documents Congress had just received showed how deep that protection really went. The records came from a subpoena issued to the Epstein estate, tens of thousands of pages, emails, financial transfers, handwritten notes, draft statements, and most critically, internal correspondence that directly contradicts testimony previously given under oath. For years, officials claimed there was not enough evidence to pursue stronger charges. For years, survivors were told the case was too complex, too old, or outside proper jurisdiction. But these documents told a very different story. A story where the justice system didn't simply fail to reach the truth, but appeared to bend itself into a shape designed to avoid it. Stansbury revealed that investigators uncovered references to individuals with enormous global influence. These were not guesses or rumors. They were documented statements attributed to Epstein himself. Notes describing conversations about silence, about leverage, about political sensitivities, about people the system seemed unusually reluctant to examine. And while she did not accuse anyone outright, she asked a far more unsettling question. Why were these individuals never seriously questioned at all? Why were their connections brushed aside? Why did their appearances in flight logs, private residences, or elite social settings never trigger a full federal investigation? The shock in the room wasn't only about who appeared in the files. It was about how the system responded. Prosecutors had recommended federal charges only to be ignored. Internal assessments showed Epstein faced a mandatory minimum sentence under federal law, yet prosecution never followed. Investigators flagged survivor statements as credible, only to see them dismissed. And hanging over everything was the Justice Department's repeated claim, made for years, that there simply wasn't enough evidence. Stansbury then read directly from documents showing the opposite. Line prosecutors believed the evidence was there. They believed federal charges were justified. And yet nothing happened. That contradiction led to the most damaging question of all. Did the justice system fail because the evidence was weak, or because the people involved were simply too powerful? As she continued reading, the tension between the committee and Pam Bondi became impossible to ignore. Bondi had previously told Congress that certain materials did not exist. Stansbury was now holding those very materials in her hands. And in that moment, denial stopped being credible. The silence in the room said everything words no longer could. Bondi had insisted that the evidence simply wasn't strong enough. The documents told a different story. Prosecutors believed the evidence was sufficient. Bondi suggested the case slipped through the cracks. The record showed it was deliberately redirected away from federal scrutiny. With every contradiction Stansbury laid out, the same question kept rising closer to the surface. Was this incompetence, or was it a cover-up? Then came the financial records, transfers, internal notes, references to real estate discussions involving individuals with extraordinary reach and influence. Stansbury was careful. She did not present these materials as proof of criminal guilt, because that is not what the documents themselves claim. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Money moved. Meetings happened. Conversations took place. Powerful people interacted with Epstein in ways that should have triggered at least basic investigative follow-up. And yet, there was none. That was the point. Not guilt, but absence, silence. Empty spaces where serious questions should have been asked but never were, with each page she cited. It became harder for the committee to pretend this was an isolated failure. The picture that emerged was systemic. Law enforcement deferred responsibility to prosecutors. Prosecutors deferred upward to leadership. Leadership deferred to political sensitivities. And at every layer, the outcome stayed the same. Victims were ignored. Powerful individuals were left untouched. Transparency was avoided. Accountability never arrived. That is why her testimony landed with such force. Stansbury wasn't just describing what happened. She was explaining why it mattered. Survivors were dismissed. Evidence was minimized. Files were sealed, hidden, or heavily redacted. For years, the people entrusted with enforcing justice treated this case as an inconvenience instead of a crime. A problem to manage, not a truth to confront. Then she turned directly to the committee and made her demand unmistakably clear. Release the files. All of them unredacted, no more summaries. No more selective disclosures. No more hiding behind claims of ongoing investigations as a shield. Let the public see what was ignored, who was involved, and how the system failed. She wasn't calling for punishment. She was calling for transparency. Because without transparency, accountability doesn't exist. And without accountability, justice becomes whatever those in power decide it should be. What made the moment even more striking was Bondi's reaction. For months, she had controlled the narrative, repeating that her department had been cooperative, thorough, and transparent. But as Stansbury read directly from the documents, that confidence visibly cracked. Bondi shifted in her chair. She avoided eye contact. She leaned on rehearsed phrases. And the longer Stansbury spoke, the clearer it became that Bondi's public story did not match the story. Preserved in the evidence, one of the most gripping moments came when Stansbury explained a phrase found in the documents. a phrase that sent a chill through the room. The dog that hadn't barked. This phrase, the dog that hadn't barked, carried a weight that transcended mere words. Epstein used it in multiple documents to describe someone who, despite being present, aware or deeply connected, never spoke to investigators, never raised concerns, never acknowledged what was happening. It wasn't a comment on guilt. It was a comment on silence. A silence that, according to the documents, seemed convenient. A silence that protected not the survivors, not justice, but those who wanted the truth buried. The committee room froze as Stansbury read the line. Everyone understood what it implied. Someone with influence stayed quiet. And the system allowed it. Then she turned to the survivors, the girls who came forward. Dismissed, minimized, told there wasn't enough evidence to pursue their claims. She reminded Congress that behind every redacted page, behind every ignored file, behind every secret deal, there were real people who suffered while the system shielded those with power. Stansbury made a rare appeal: step outside politics and act as human beings. Not as Democrats or Republicans, not as appointees or officials. Act as people with the authority to expose the truth. She closed her testimony with a stark warning. If Congress does not release the full, unredacted Epstein files, public trust will erode, not just in this investigation, but in the justice system itself. When power hides behind sealed documents, redactions, and bureaucratic excuses, the law ceases to protect the vulnerable. It becomes a weapon for the powerful. This is the real story: a justice system that protected influence over victims, a political environment where transparency became optional, and documents that, after years of excuses, reveal what was hidden. The question now is whether Congress will act. Whether Pam Bondi will release everything, or whether more hearings, more contradictions, and more public pressure will be necessary to force transparency. These files are more than paper. They are a test of whether truth still matters, a test of whether justice applies equally, a test of whether Congress is willing to stand up not against individuals, but against a system that failed the people it was supposed to serve. If you believe this investigation must continue and the full truth must be released, make your voice heard, demand transparency, stay informed. And for more breakdowns like this, hit subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. This story is far from over, and the next chapter could reveal even more than what Congress has seen so far.